My cheek stung before I understood what had happened. The sound cracked across the marble hall, and every head turned toward us, toward the man who hit me, and the woman who did not move. My name is Clara Winslow, and I did not lift a hand to my father. I lifted my chin. Around us, flags hung heavy. A brass band faltered mid-note. My breath held, waiting for permission to exist. My father's voice tried to fill the silence, something about family and shame, but it wobbled in the vaulted air. I could taste metal. I heard the scrape of chair legs gather into a single, impossible sound. It happened all at once. Boots thudded. Rows rose. 400 Navy SEALs came to their feet as one, shoulders squared, faces set. 2 generals stepped out from the aisle, their eyes cutting to me. The hall breathed with them, in and out, until the moment snapped and their voices rolled together like thunder. Admiral Winslow, awaiting orders. The words struck the crystal chandeliers and came back twice as loud. My father's hand, the one that had just found my face, hung in the air like it didn't know where to land. People pressed their lips together. Some stood without meaning to. The band went silent. Even the flag seemed to tremble. Somewhere a glass chimed against a table and went utterly still. On the dais, a camera light blinked red and held. I didn't speak. I let the quiet do what I trained it to do, hold a line. There was no revenge in my throat, no plea, no sermon. Only the steadiness years hammered into me, the steadiness that carried me farther than anyone here expected. Admiral Winslow, awaiting orders. I met my father's eyes, and for the first time, he looked away. The first time my father told me I was nothing. I was 18. That night is still carved into me sharper than the slap he gave me years later. It was August, the kind of summer evening where the heat lingers even after sunset, clinging to the skin, pressing into the lungs. My brother had just received his acceptance letter to West Point, and my father, Colonel Gerald Winslow, stood taller than I had ever seen him. Pride swelled in his chest, as though he had earned the letter himself. My mother hovered nearby, her smile small. Tired. Already practiced. I stood at the edge of the room, rehearsing in my head how I would tell him. Not West Point, not law school, not the blueprint he had sketched for me since childhood. I wanted a different path, a uniform still, but one that belonged to me. When I finally spoke, the air changed. His jaw hardened, his hand gripped the arm of his chair, and his face turned a shade darker. "You don't get to choose," he barked, his voice loud enough that our neighbor across the lawn could have heard it through the windows. "You think you're special. You're nothing without this family. Without me." My brother smirked in the corner, drinking in the attention. My mother lowered her gaze to her hands, her silence louder than his shouting. I tried to stand tall. I tried to make my voice steady. "I'm not you, Dad. I won't live your life. I'll find my own." The blow came fast, but the words after cut deeper. "Get out! You're no daughter of mine." He stormed into my room, pulled open drawers, threw clothes into a duffel bag. My pleas collapsed against his back. He thrust the bag at me and pointed to the door. My mother did not move. My brother's grin widened. That was the last night I slept under his roof. I walked down the street with the glow of our house fading behind me, rage hotter than grief in my chest. I swore under the heavy sky that I would prove him wrong, not for his sake, but for mine, for the girl he tried to bury. That vow became the fire I carried into every step that followed. I left that night with nothing but the duffel bag he had packed for me. The street was quiet, except for the hum of cicadas, and every step felt heavier than the last. I had no plan, no savings worth mentioning, and no family who wanted me. I remember passing by the darkened windows of our neighbors' homes, wondering if any of them had seen me leave and whether they thought I deserved it. I rented a room in a rundown apartment near the bus depot, a place that smelled of damp carpet and stale cigarettes. I slept on a mattress thin enough that the springs left marks on my back. The silence in that apartment was suffocating, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that reminds you every second that no one is coming for you. I cried the first few nights, fists pressed against my mouth so the tenants next door wouldn't hear. But beneath the grief, rage flickered. That rage whispered to me when I dragged myself out of bed before sunrise. It shoved me through the recruiter's office door less than a month later. I signed the papers with a steady hand, enlisting not because I thought I could succeed, but because I refused to fail. Basic training nearly broke me. They looked at me slender, unremarkable, a girl who had nowhere else to go and decided I wouldn't last a week. I could feel their doubts like knives at my back. Every time someone muttered, "She's too soft," I pushed harder. When my lungs screamed, I ran farther. When my muscles shook, I held on a second longer. At night, when I collapsed onto the bunk, bruised and aching, I heard his voice in my head. "You're no daughter of mine." The sting of that memory was sharper than any drill sergeant's bark. I used it. I fed it. Weeks turned into months. I began to learn not only how to survive, but how to fight. And somewhere in the exhaustion and the pain, I realized I was no longer trying to prove him wrong. I was proving myself right. That was the first step toward becoming someone he could never erase. Combat stripped away illusions faster than training ever could. The first time I boarded a transport bound for the desert, the air was thick with sand and anticipation. The men around me checked their rifles with muscle memory, their eyes avoiding mine. I was still the outsider, still the one they expected to falter. But when the shooting started, when the air cracked with gunfire and the night burned with tracer rounds, none of that mattered. Survival didn't care about prejudice. It only cared about who could hold the line, who could drag a wounded comrade out of an alley under fire, who could keep their head when chaos roared. I remember carrying Corporal Mendoza on my back after a roadside explosion tore into our convoy. My legs shook, my lungs seared, but I didn't stop. I felt his blood soaking into my uniform, heard him whisper prayers he wasn't sure would reach anyone. When we reached cover, I collapsed beside him, gasping, but he lived. After that night, the eyes of the men around me changed. Suspicion gave way to something else, something closer to trust. Years passed in deployments that blurred together dusty villages, makeshift outposts, nights filled with distant explosions, and the metallic taste of fear. I learned to lead not by shouting, but by doing. When rations were scarce, I ate last. When exhaustion dragged us down, I carried more weight than my share. Slowly, without ever asking for it, respect began to grow. By the time I pinned on Lieutenant Commander, I had more scars than medals. Some were etched on my skin, others carved deeper, invisible but permanent. I buried friends, I folded flags, I wrote letters to parents who would never see their children walk through the door again. And still, not once, did I hear from my family. No letters, no calls. My name might as well have been struck from their records. So I built a new family, one forged in battle and silence. Men and women who knew me not as the daughter my father rejected, but as the officer they trusted to bring them home. Ceremonies came and went, but my side of the stage was always empty. I stood at attention while others had mothers pin medals to their chests, fathers shaking their hands with pride. I saluted, smiled for the photographs, then walked back alone. The ache was sharp at first, like a fresh wound, but over time it dulled into something quieter, heavier. Silence became my constant companion. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the suffocating kind. The silence of absence. My father never called. My mother never wrote. My brother never reached out. Their silence told me exactly what I meant to them, nothing. And yet, I carried that silence like weight plates on my shoulders, training myself to turn it into strength. I kept climbing. Every deployment carved something new into me. I learned weapons, tactics, the 1,000 small calculations that decide who comes home alive. When men twice my size started following my orders without question, I understood what leadership really meant. It wasn't about barking commands. It was about walking first into the fire so they would believe they could make it through, too. By the time I entered the SEAL community, the whispers had already begun. Some called it impossible, others a publicity stunt that would fail quickly. But I stayed. I endured. Every time the instructors tried to break me, I thought of my father's words, and I let them forge me into something harder than steel. Years passed, and I rose not because I sought glory, but because I refused to quit. My name appeared in reports, then in briefings, then in the mouths of commanders who needed results. Still, I never reached back to the man who cast me out. Some silences, I had decided, were earned. What mattered more than titles were the people who chose to stand with me. Men and women who would follow me into fire, who saw not weakness or shame, but someone they trusted with their lives. They became my true family. And with them, without fanfare, I kept rising. The morning it arrived, I almost tossed it aside with the rest of the formal mail that cluttered my desk. Heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, the kind of thing meant to impress politicians and retired officers. But when I read the list of honorees, my hand froze. Colonel Gerald Winslow, my father. 15 years had passed since the night he shoved a duffel bag into my arms and told me I was no daughter of his. In those years, I had buried friends, commanded missions whispered about in classified briefings, and carried scars he would never see. I thought I had buried him too, at least the version of him that mattered to me. Yet there it was, the Veterans Honor Banquet, a national ceremony celebrating generations of service. And suddenly, the silence I had lived with for so long cracked open. I stared at the invitation for hours. I could have ignored it. I could have thrown it in the trash, buried it under paperwork, pretended it never reached me. No one would have blamed me. But there was something inside me, steady and insistent, that said I had to go. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't reconciliation either. It was truth, the kind that can't stay hidden forever, the kind that insists on standing in the light. The morning of the banquet. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than I should have. The woman staring back at me barely resembled the girl who walked away from home with a single bag. My uniform was immaculate, the white fabric gleaming, ribbons and medals polished until they caught the light. 4 stars on my shoulders, each one a scar as much as an honor. Would he recognize me? Would he see anything beyond the daughter he cast aside? The questions flickered, but I forced them down. I wasn't going for him. I was going because the silence had lasted long enough. And when I walked into that hall, he would have no choice but to face what he had done. The hall was dressed like a cathedral of memory, rows of flags lining the stage, polished wood floors reflecting the chandeliers, a brass band playing soft hymns that sounded older than any of us. Veterans filled the seats, their jackets heavy with medals. Families leaned close, whispering pride and anticipation. My boots struck the marble with each step, steady and unhurried, though inside my pulse thundered. Heads turned as I entered. Some whispered my name, others rose instinctively at the sight of my rank. I did not come with an entourage. I came alone, because that was how I had lived most of my life. And then I saw him, Colonel Gerald Winslow, sitting near the front with my mother beside him, and my brother just beyond. His hair was silver now, his posture still straight, his chest decorated with medals he wore like armor. My mother's face had thinned with age. Her eyes flicked to me and widened. My brother's mouth twisted into a scowl. But my father, he clenched his jaw so hard I thought his teeth might crack. I gave a polite nod, hoping to slip into a seat without disruption. But he rose. The scrape of his chair against the floor screeched through the music, silencing the room. "You're not welcome here," he roared, his voice booming across the vaulted ceiling. Every conversation stopped. The band fell silent. Eyes pivoted toward us. My chest rose and fell, calm on the outside. But inside, I felt the old wound tear open. And then, before I could move, His hand lashed out. The crack of his palm against my cheek echoed through the hall, sharp, undeniable. Gasps rippled. Some guests averted their eyes. Others froze, caught in the moment. The sting burned across my face, but I did not flinch, not this time, not after everything, because I knew what was coming. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. His hand still hovered in the air, trembling slightly, as though even he realized what he had just done. My cheek throbbed, but I stood rooted to the marble floor, my gaze locked on him. The silence in the room was suffocating. People held their breath, waiting for me to break, waiting for tears, or anger, or collapse. My father expected it too. I could see it in the way his lip curled, confident that he had reduced me once again to the powerless girl he had thrown out so many years ago. But the silence didn't last. It shattered beneath the sound of hundreds of chairs sliding back in unison. Boots struck the floor like thunder rolling across the hall. I turned my head just enough to see them rise row upon row of Navy SEALs, 400 strong, every one of them standing tall and unyielding. Their faces were carved from stone, their eyes fixed not on my father, but on me. And then came the roar, a single voice multiplied by hundreds, joined by two generals who stepped forward, their salutes crisp and sharp. The chandeliers above trembled with the vibration of it. Admiral Winslow, awaiting orders. The words shook the hall like artillery. Guests recoiled, some clutching their chests, others instinctively rising to their feet as though their bodies recognized the authority in that sound. My father's face drained of color. The proud colonel, once the master of my humiliation, suddenly looked small. His medals gleamed, but they no longer carried weight. A veteran in the crowd rose to her feet, her hair white as snow, her voice carrying steady across the silence. She saved my son in Kandahar, pulled him out under fire when no one else could. He lived because of her. Another voice followed. She commanded the black tide operation. Half of us wouldn't be here if not for her. Dozens more joined, each affirmation rising like a wave, drowning out my father's rage with the undeniable truth of who I had become. The hall no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me. And still, I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was command. My silence told them to hold, to stand fast. And they did. I looked back at my father. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. My father stumbled back a step, his hand falling limply to his side. The mask of authority he had worn his entire life cracked before my eyes, revealing a man who was suddenly smaller than the room he once commanded. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Around us, the voices of veterans still echoed, their memories binding my story into the walls of that hall. I did not strike him back. I did not scream. I did not demand the apology I knew would never come. Instead, I stood tall, my silence wrapping around him like chains. Every second he trembled beneath that silence, he was forced to face what he had lost, not just a daughter, but the chance to ever call me his again. The generals saluted once more, their presence like pillars on either side of me. The SEALs remained at attention, their fury held in check only because I had not released it. I felt their loyalty radiating through the air, a shield stronger than any words. My father tried again, his voice cracking. "She's nothing. She's weak." But no one believed him. The evidence stood before them, 2 generals, 400 warriors, and the veterans whose voices carried the weight of truth. His words shattered like glass, leaving him exposed. I turned, my boots striking the marble like gunfire. The soldiers parted for me, their eyes never leaving me, and the hall rose in applause, not polite, not perfunctory, but thunderous, rolling, undeniable. At the doorway, I paused. I let the sound wash over me, not as a prize, but as proof. Proof that survival, resilience, and truth outlast every lie. I did not look back. My silence was my answer. My silence was my victory. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is not revenge at all. It is living so fully, so fiercely, that even those who once tried to erase you can no longer deny who you are. I was Clara Winslow, and I left him to drown in the silence he had earned.